Imagine stepping back in time to the year 800. And what if your future wasn't yours to decide, but determined by a man? What if your ability to eat, to have a roof over your head, or even to simply exist, depended entirely on a husband, a father, or a brother? Get ready, because we're about to explore a world where, for women, economic independence was a wild, almost unthinkable dream. Number 12. Religious and social norms in 800. Life was deeply shaped by the prevailing religious and social beliefs which for much of Europe meant Christianity, though other regions had their own dominant faiths. These belief systems often reinforced a very specific idea about the roles of men and women, with profound impacts on a woman's economic standing. Think of it this way. What people believed about God and the natural order directly influenced how society was structured, including who held power and who controlled resources. For women, this often meant a narrative of submission and domesticity. Religious texts and interpretations frequently emphasized women's roles as wives, mothers, and caretakers of the household, viewing their primary purpose as procreation and the nurturing of children. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was often presented as a divine decree, a fundamental truth about how the world was meant to operate. Such teachings fostered a social climate where a woman's identity and worth were primarily tied to her marital status and her ability to bear and raise children. A woman who remained unmarried or who was unable to have children might find her social standing and economic security greatly diminished. For example, within Christian societies, the story of Eve's creation and the concept of original sin were sometimes interpreted in ways that placed women in a subordinate position to men, implying a need for male guidance and control. This theological framework translated into everyday life, limiting opportunities for women to engage in public life, hold positions of authority, or pursue independent economic ventures. If a woman's natural place was considered to be within the home, dedicated to domestic tasks and child-rearing, then any ambition to work outside that sphere, to accumulate wealth independently, or to participate in commerce, inappropriate or even morally questionable. The concept of a woman owning a successful business or managing vast estates on her own was for the most part outside the accepted social paradigm. Instead, her economic contribution was often seen as internal to the family unit, through household management, food preservation, and the production of goods for home consumption, rather than through external trade or waged labor. Chronicles and legal documents from the time, such as early Frankish capitularies or Anglo-Saxon laws, rarely mention women in roles of economic power outside of specific, aristocratic, or monastic contexts. And even then, their authority was often derived from their male relatives or their position within a religious institution. Prevailing social narrative reinforced the idea that men were the natural providers and protectors venturing out into the world to farm, fight, or trade, while women were the keepers of the home, reliant on men for their material needs and security. This division of labor, presented as both natural and divinely ordained, firmly rooted women in a position of economic dependence, making it incredibly difficult for them to forge their own paths or accumulate wealth independent of a male guardian or spouse. Number 11. Limited direct involvement in trade and commerce. Imagine a bustling marketplace in 800 alive with the sounds of haggling, the scent of spices, and the sight of merchants displaying their wares. While women certainly played a vital role in household production, creating many goods for their family's use, their direct participation in large-scale trade and commerce was significantly limited compared to men. This wasn't because women lacked skill or intelligence, but due to a combination of social norms, practical challenges, and legal restrictions. For instance, long-distance trade, which could be incredibly lucrative, was a dangerous and arduous undertaking. It involved traveling vast distances, often through untamed lands or across treacherous seas, facing risks from bandits, unpredictable weather, and unfamiliar territories. This kind of journey required physical strength, a certain degree of freedom from domestic responsibilities, and the ability to negotiate with strangers, sometimes in foreign languages. These were all areas where women were either socially discouraged or physically disadvantaged. A woman traveling alone, or even with a small group, would have faced immense social disapproval and heightened personal danger, making such ventures almost impossible. Furthermore, significant trade often required access to capital networks and legal recognition. Men, by virtue of their status as heads of households and legal entities, were far more likely to possess or acquire these resources. They could inherit property, form partnerships, or take out loans, all of which were crucial for engaging in substantial commerce. Women, particularly married women, often lacked the legal standing to enter into contracts independently or to own significant assets in their own name, making it difficult for them to participate as independent merchants or traders. While women might sell surplus produce from their gardens or handicrafts they made at home, this was generally small scale. Local trade often conducted as part of their household duties rather than as a primary source of independent income. For example, a woman might sell eggs or cheese at a local village market, or perhaps some spun wool or woven items she produced. This supplemental income, while useful, was rarely enough to support her independently or to provide her with economic power equal to that of a man engaged in larger commerce. Evidence from medieval chronicles and legal codes suggests that formal merchant guilds, which were powerful organizations controlling much of the era's trade, were overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, male. Membership in these guilds provided access to markets, protection, and opportunities for apprenticeships, all of which were largely closed off to women. Without these structured avenues for professional growth and economic accumulation, women were largely excluded from the most profitable and influential sectors of the economy. The economic systems of the time were simply not designed to accommodate or empower women as independent actors in the realm of widespread trade and commerce, solidifying their economic reliance on men who dominated these arenas. Number 10. Protection and security. Imagine living in a time when there were no police forces as we know them today, no national armies consistently patrolling every corner of the land, and certainly no established legal systems to guarantee your safety against physical harm or theft. In 800, a life could be incredibly dangerous, and personal safety was often a matter of who you knew and who could protect you. This pervasive insecurity played a massive role in women's economic dependence on men. A woman by herself was far more vulnerable to violence, kidnapping, or robbery. Whether it was the threat of roaming bandits, rival clans, or even predatory individuals within her own community, physical protection was a critical need that most women could not provide for themselves. Men, particularly those with fighting skills or access to weapons, were seen as the natural protectors of their families and communities. A father, a husband, or a male relative provided a crucial field against these dangers. This protection wasn't just about physical safety. It also extended to the security of property and resources. If a family's land or possessions were threatened, it was the men who were expected to defend them, often with force. Without this male protection, a woman and her children could easily lose everything they owned, including their home, livestock, and any stored food. For example, if a widow was left without adult sons, her land might be vulnerable to encroachment from powerful neighbors, or her children might be kidnapped for ransom or servitude. Her ability to hold onto her inherited property, even if she technically owned it, was often contingent on having a male relative willing and able to defend her rights and possessions. This dependency on male physical power also influenced women's mobility. Traveling alone or even with other women was highly risky. A woman needed male escorts for journeys, whether it was to visit relatives, attend a market, or travel to a new home upon marriage. This limitation on movement inherently restricted her economic opportunities. She couldn't easily pursue trade, seek work in a distant town, or manage properties far from her immediate protected locale. The very act of moving about the world, which is essential for many economic activities, was often contingent on male protection. This created a cycle. Women were seen as needing protection, so their roles were confined to safer domestic spheres, which in turn limited their economic avenues, reinforcing their dependence on men for their security and by extension their material well-being. The pervasive threat of violence and the absence of robust public safety mechanisms meant that the male role as protector was not merely a social construct, but a vital, tangible necessity for survival and economic stability. Number 9. Lack of formal education and literacy. Imagine a world where books are rare. Writing is a specialized skill, and schools as we know them simply don't exist for the vast majority of people. In 800, access to formal education and literacy was incredibly limited, and for women it was even more so. This wasn't just about reading stories, it had profound economic implications, creating another significant barrier to independence. Most education at this time revolved around practical skills learned within the household or through apprenticeships, particularly for boys. Girls were primarily taught domestic skills, how to manage a home, preserve food, tend to children, and perhaps engage in some spinning or weaving. While these skills were vital for the family's survival and well-being, they generally did not open doors to external economic opportunities or independent wealth accumulation. Literacy, the ability to read and write, was a powerful tool. It was essential for engaging in complex legal matters, managing large estates, conducting long-distance trade, or participating in the burgeoning administrative structures of kingdoms and churches. If you couldn't read contracts, keep accounts, or write letters, your ability to participate in anything beyond local informal transactions was severely hampered. For example, imagine trying to negotiate a complex land deal or manage a large agricultural enterprise without being able to read official documents or keep detailed records of harvests and sales. It would be nearly impossible. Most women were not taught to read or write, even within aristocratic families. While some noble women might receive a basic education from a tutor or within a convent, this was the exception, not the rule. Their education, even when it occurred, often focused on religious texts or domestic management, rather than the practical skills needed for public economic engagement. For the vast majority of common women, literacy was an unknown concept. This lack of formal education meant women were largely excluded from professions that required reading and writing, such as scribes, notaries, legal advisors, or even high-level merchants who needed to keep ledgers and communicate with distant partners. These roles were predominantly filled by men, who then held a monopoly on the economic power derived from such specialized knowledge. The ability to read and interpret laws or religious texts also conferred authority and influence, which were largely denied to women through their lack of education. Therefore, while women were indispensable in the daily running of households and the production of goods for consumption, their exclusion from formal education and literacy meant they were largely shut out of the more complex, higher-value economic activities that required written communication and record-keeping, thereby solidifying their economic dependence on men who commanded these essential skills. Number 8. Childbearing and rearing duties. In 800 AD, families were large and women were expected to bear many children. This wasn't just a social expectation. It was a biological reality and a crucial economic necessity for the survival of the family and community. But these duties, while incredibly important, also placed significant constraints on a woman's ability to pursue independent economic ventures, solidifying her dependence on men. Imagine the sheer physical demands of constant pregnancy and childbirth in a time with no modern medicine, no pain relief, and high rates of infant and maternal mortality. A woman might be pregnant for much of her adult life. From her late teens through her 30s or even 40s, each pregnancy was a period of physical vulnerability and reduced mobility, limiting her capacity to engage in strenuous labor or travel. After birth, the demands of nursing and caring for infants and young children were all-consuming. There were no daycare centers, no ready-made baby food, and usually no paid childcare options. The survival of the next generation depended directly on the mother's constant attention and nourishment. This meant that a woman's time and energy were overwhelmingly dedicated to domestic tasks and childcare. While she might still spin wool, weave cloth, prepare food, or tend to a small garden, these activities were often performed concurrently with, and secondary to, her primary role as carer. The idea of a woman leaving her home for extended periods to work in the fields, travel for trade, or engage in a profession outside the household was simply not feasible for most. Her presence was essential for the survival and well-being of her children. Furthermore, children themselves were an economic asset in an agrarian society. They provided labor for the farm and security for their parents in old age. Bearing many children was seen as a woman's contribution to the family's wealth and future. However, this contribution was largely indirect, through the creation of future laborers, rather than direct independent income generation. For example, a woman might spend hours every day grinding grain, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, and caring for several children, from infants to toddlers to older children. This exhaustive workload left little to no time or energy for activities that could generate independent wealth, such as craft production for sale beyond the household or participation in markets. Her economic function was inextricably linked to the survival and maintenance of the family unit, largely within the domestic sphere, making her reliant on the male head of the household, who was responsible for providing the external resources necessary to sustain the family. Continuous cycle of childbearing and rearing effectively anchored women to the home, limiting their economic agency and reinforcing their dependence. Number 7. Dependence on male labor in agriculture and production. Picture the vast fields of 800 Ah, the forests that provided timber, or the mines that yielded precious metals. The economy of this era was overwhelmingly agrarian, meaning most people lived off the land, growing food, raising animals, and producing basic necessities. In this system, heavy labor and the control of large-scale production were primarily the domain of men, creating a fundamental economic dependence for women. While women certainly played vital roles in agriculture, tending gardens, milking animals, processing food, and helping with harvests, the physically demanding tasks of plowing, harrowing, felling trees, building structures, and defending crops and livestock from wild animals or raiders largely fell to men. These were the activities that often determined the primary output and economic viability of a farm or settlement. For example, without a man to plow the fields, a family might not be able to plant enough grain to survive the winter. Without men to hunt or manage livestock, the family would lack crucial protein sources. Without men to fell timber, they wouldn't have wood for heating, cooking, or building. This division of labor meant that the largest and most critical sources of sustenance and wealth were typically controlled by men. The vast majority of land was worked by men, and decisions about what to plant, when to harvest, and how to manage the overall agricultural enterprise were usually made by the male head of the household. His labor was seen as the primary engine of the family's economic output. Moreover, beyond agriculture, industries like metalworking, masonry, and carpentry were almost exclusively male-dominated. These crafts were vital for creating tools, weapons, buildings, and infrastructure, all of which were essential for both daily life and any form of economic growth. Women were rarely found in these trades, partly due to the physical demands, but also due to social norms and the structure of apprenticeship systems which excluded them. Even in household production, where women excelled at tasks like spinning thread, weaving cloth, and preparing food, the raw materials often came from male-controlled sources, e.g., wool from sheep tended by men, grain from fields plowed by men. Tools used, such as looms or grinding stones, might also be produced by male artisans. So, even in their domestic, productive roles, women were often dependent on men for the very resources and tools they needed to create goods. The economic structure of 800 AD, built upon heavy physical labor and specialized crafts, inherently privileged male contributions to primary production, making women economically reliant on men for their fundamental needs. Number 6. Marriage as the primary economic arrangement for women. Forget modern notions of romantic love being the sole reason for marriage. In 800 AD, marriage was first and foremost an economic and social contract, a powerful institution that largely dictated a woman's economic security and standing. For most women, getting married was not just a personal choice. It was an absolute necessity for survival and a way to secure a place within society. An unmarried woman, especially one without significant inherited wealth or a protective male relative, faced an incredibly precarious existence. She might have little or no means of support, no legal standing, and no social recognition. Marriage provided her with a husband who became her legal guardian, her protector, and her primary provider. His home became her home. His resources, her resources, at least in terms of sustenance and shelter. For instance, a young woman coming from a family of modest means would have little hope of acquiring land, building a home, or supporting herself independently. Her best, and often only, path to a secure future was to marry a man who could provide these things. This meant that the choice of a husband was often less about personal affection and more about his economic prospects, his land holdings, his wealth, his family's standing, and his ability to provide for a household. Negotiations between families about a marriage often focused intensely on economic considerations, such as the dowry a bride brought with her, if any, and the dower or mourning gift the groom provided her, which might be her security if she became a widow. These were not optional extras but fundamental components of the marriage contract, clearly illustrating its economic bedrock. A woman's social status also became tied to her husband's. If he was a respected landowner or a skilled artisan, she would share in that respect and the economic benefits that came with it. If he was poor or of low status, her life would reflect that. In many legal systems of the time, once married, a woman effectively lost her individual legal identity and became subsumed under her husband's. She could not own property independently, enter into contracts, or conduct business without her husband's permission or direct involvement. Her labor within the household, while essential, was considered to contribute to the family unit, not to her independent wealth. Should her husband die, a widow's situation could again become extremely vulnerable. While some societies had provisions for dower lands or property, her continued security often depended on her adult sons or male relatives or the willingness of the community to support her. The institution of marriage, therefore, was not merely a social custom. It was the primary mechanism through which women gained economic stability and integration into the prevailing social order, reinforcing their deep reliance on men. Number 5. Limited access to professions and guilds. Imagine a world where most jobs beyond basic farming or household chores are locked behind exclusive doors, accessible only to a select few. In 800 AD, as specialized crafts and trades began to develop, access to these professions and the emerging guilds that governed them was overwhelmingly restricted to men. This created a significant economic barrier for women, limiting their ability to earn independent income and thrive outside the domestic sphere. Guilds, which were organizations of artisans or merchants in a particular trade, were powerful economic forces. They controlled who could practice a trade, how much they could charge, and how apprentices were trained. Membership in a guild offered stability, economic protection, and access to a network of skilled workers and clients. For example, a blacksmith's guild would ensure that only qualified individuals could practice the trade, thereby maintaining quality and controlling competition. Almost universally, these guilds were male-dominated and often explicitly excluded women from membership. While women might assist in their husbands' workshops, performing tasks like preparing materials or selling finished goods, they were rarely recognized as independent masters of a trade. The formal apprenticeship systems, which were the primary way to learn a craft and eventually join a guild, were also typically closed to girls. A young boy might be apprenticed to a carpenter, a shoemaker, or a baker, learning the skills of the trade over many years. A young girl, on the other hand, was expected to learn household skills from her mother or other female relatives. This meant that women were largely shut out of lucrative and skilled professions that could lead to economic independence. Imagine a woman who was naturally skilled at carving wood or creating beautiful pottery. Without the formal training of an apprenticeship or the protection and recognition of a guild, she would struggle to sell her wares beyond her immediate community, let alone compete with male artisans who had these advantages. Even in professions where women had historically played a role, such as brewing beer or baking bread, the increasing formalization and professionalization often led to men taking over these more profitable ventures, pushing women back into less formal, less lucrative, and more domestic roles. For instance, in many places, brewing evolved from a household task into a commercial enterprise, often controlled by men who could invest in larger equipment and secure licenses, leaving women to brew only for their families. Cumulative effect of these restrictions was that women had very few avenues to earn significant independent income or build wealth through professional work. Their labor, though essential, remained largely informal, unpaid, or restricted to low-status, low-paying tasks, reinforcing their economic reliance on men who dominated the more organized and profitable sectors of the economy. Number 4. Legal status and male guardianship. Imagine a legal system where you, as an adult, are still treated like a minor, unable to make significant decisions about your own life or property without the permission of a male relative. This was often the reality for women in 800 AD. Their legal status, typically under the perpetual guardianship of men, was a cornerstone of their economic dependence. In many early medieval societies, women were legally considered perpetual minors, regardless of their age. This meant they could not act independently in most legal or economic matters. A father held guardianship over his unmarried daughters, and upon marriage, this authority typically transferred to her husband. If she became a widow, guardianship might pass to an adult son, a brother, or another male relative. For example, under many customary laws, a woman could not own property in her own right, or if she did, she could not manage or sell it without her male guardian's consent. Imagine trying to buy a piece of land, negotiate a contract for goods, or even sell inherited property, only to be told you lacked the legal capacity to do so. Any transaction she entered into might be considered invalid, unless approved by her male guardian. This wasn't just a formality, it had real economic consequences. It meant that women often couldn't control their own dowries once married, couldn't inherit property directly and freely, and certainly couldn't engage in independent business ventures that required legal agreements or financial leverage. If a woman wanted to borrow money, lend money, or establish a commercial enterprise, she needed a man to act on her behalf, essentially limiting her economic agency to what her male guardian deemed appropriate or advantageous. Consider the scenario of a woman whose husband dies. While some legal customs might grant her a dower or a portion of her deceased husband's property, her ability to manage this property, defend it against claims, or invest it for her own future was often contingent on having a male relative to act as her legal representative. Without such a guardian, her dower rights might be difficult to enforce, or her assets could be vulnerable to usurpation. This legal framework meant that a woman's economic identity was often subsumed within that of her male guardian. Her economic decisions, her access to resources, and her participation in any formal economic activity were filtered through and controlled by male authority. This systemic legal incapacity severely limited women's opportunities for independent wealth accumulation and financial self-sufficiency, locking them into a position of inherent reliance on men for their economic well-being and legal standing. Number 3. The dowry system. Imagine a system where, upon marriage, your family provides a significant transfer of wealth, assets, or goods to your husband or his family. That's the dowry system, a widespread practice in 800 AD across various cultures, and it profoundly shaped a woman's economic dependence, despite seeming like a transfer from her family. While the dowry might seem like a way for a woman to bring economic resources into her new marriage, its primary function often reinforced her reliance on her husband. The dowry was typically managed by the husband and was intended to help establish or support the new marital household, often becoming part of the husband's property. It wasn't primarily for the wife's independent use or control. For instance, a dowry might consist of land, livestock, tools, household goods, or even money. This dowry was a crucial part of the marriage negotiation, reflecting the social and economic standing of the bride's family. Without a sufficient dowry, a woman might struggle to find a suitable husband, particularly one of good standing or wealth. This placed immense pressure on a bride's family to provide a dowry, sometimes impoverishing them in the process. The dowry wasn't a gift to the bride that she could then use to start her own business or invest independently. Instead, it was an endowment to the marital union, managed by the husband as the head of the household. If the husband died, some legal traditions might dictate that the dowry revert to the wife or her family, or a portion of it might be set aside for her use as a widow, often called a dower or mourning gift from the husband's side. However, even then her control over these assets might be limited, often requiring male guardianship, as discussed earlier. The dowry system reinforced a woman's economic dependence in several ways. Firstly, it often meant she had little control over the wealth she brought into the marriage. It was essentially handed over to her husband's management. Secondly, it emphasized the idea that a woman needed an economic contribution from her family to become marriageable and thus secure her future, rather than building her own wealth independently. Her value in the marriage market was often tied to the dowry, rather than her own earning potential or skills. Thirdly, it solidified the husband's role as the primary economic manager of the household. The dowry merged into his overall assets, strengthening his control over the family's resources. While the dowry did provide an important economic foundation for the new family, it largely funneled a woman's family wealth through her husband, rather than empowering her directly. It was a mechanism that facilitated her entry into a dependent economic arrangement, rather than fostering her economic autonomy. Number 2. Inheritance laws and practices. Imagine a world where your gender alone largely determines whether you can inherit your family's wealth, land, or even their name. In 800, inheritance laws and customs across many societies were heavily biased towards male heirs, creating a fundamental economic dependence for women. For the vast majority of families, especially those with land or significant property, the custom of male primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits everything, or similar patrilineal systems was common. This meant that sons, particularly the eldest, were the primary inheritors of land, titles, and wealth. Daughters, on the other hand, often received far less or nothing at all in terms of direct inheritance that they could control independently. For example, if a wealthy landowner died, his estate, including his fields, livestock, and even the family home, would typically pass to his son. His daughters might receive a dowry upon marriage, but this was a one-time allocation intended to facilitate a marriage, not a share of the family's ongoing wealth. It was also, as discussed, usually managed by her husband, If a family had no sons, the situation could be complex. Sometimes daughters might inherit, but often under specific conditions. Or the land might be divided among male relatives, or even revert to an overlord. The goal was often to keep land and power within the male line, preserving family continuity and avoiding the fragmentation of estates. This legal bias meant that women had extremely limited opportunities to accumulate wealth through inheritance. While a woman might inherit movable goods or some household items, the most significant forms of wealth, land, and productive assets were largely out of her reach. This made it nearly impossible for a woman to establish her own economic base, such as starting a farm or a business through inherited means. She was therefore reliant on a male relative, her father, brother, or husband, to provide for her economically. Her future economic security was tied not to her own family's wealth passing directly to her, but to her ability to marry into a family with wealth, or to be supported by her male kin. Even if a woman was a widow, her rights to her deceased husband's property were often limited. While she might receive a dower, a portion of his property set aside for her maintenance, this was usually for her lifetime and could not be passed on to her own heirs. Moreover, her control over this dower property was often subject to the oversight of her adult sons or other male relatives. The overall effect of these inheritance patterns was to systematically deny women direct access to and control over the most significant forms of wealth, ensuring that economic power remained concentrated in the hands of men across generations, thereby cementing women's reliance on them for their economic sustenance and security. Number 1. Lack of property, ownership, and control. Imagine a life where the very ground beneath your feet, the house you live in, and the resources that feed your family are not truly yours to own or control. In 800, for most women, the ability to independently own, manage, or dispose of significant property, especially land, was severely restricted, if not entirely impossible. This fundamental lack of property rights was arguably the most powerful factor contributing to women's economic dependence on men. In an agrarian society, land was the ultimate source of wealth and power. It provided food, shelter, and a means of production. Yet, under the prevailing legal and social customs of the time, land ownership was overwhelmingly vested in men. A woman was rarely the legal proprietor of land in her own name. For example, if a family owned a farm, the land was considered to belong to the male head of the household, the father, and then his son. Even if a woman contributed immense labor to cultivating the land, it was not legally hers. When she married, her legal identity, including any potential claims to property, was often absorbed into her husband's. He became the legal owner and manager of all family assets, including any property she might have brought with her as a dowry. He had the right to make decisions about the land, sell it, or lease it, often without her consent. She might live on the land, work on it, and benefit from its produce, but she did not hold the title or the ultimate control. This meant that a woman's economic security was directly tied to the goodwill and continued existence of her male guardian or husband. If her husband died, her situation could become precarious. While some customs provided for a widow's dower, which was typically a portion of her husband's estate, set aside for her use during her lifetime, this was often a right of usufruct, the right to use and enjoy the profits of property belonging to another, rather than full ownership. She could use the land or its produce to support herself, but she usually couldn't sell it, mortgage it, or bequeath it to her chosen heirs. Furthermore, even her dower rights might be contested or difficult to enforce without strong male backing. The absence of independent property rights meant that women had no collateral for loans, no independent source of long-term income, and no secure asset base to fall back on in times of hardship. If a woman had no male relatives or a supportive husband, she could find herself utterly destitute, with no legal claim to land or wealth. This inherent inability to own and control the most significant economic asset of the era land meant that women were fundamentally reliant on men to provide them with a home, food, and the means to live, cementing their economic dependence at the very core of their existence.